안녕하세요. 김지윤입니다. 오늘 좀 특별한 손님과 함께 대화를 나눠보려고 하는데요. 여러분 잘 아시는 노동의 종말의 저자시죠? 제러미 리프킨 작가와 인터뷰를 하려고 합니다. 요번에 신간이 나왔어요. 회복력시대라는 책인데요. 그래서 과연 이 책에서는 앞으로 우리가 어떻게 살아나가야 될지 한번 리프킨 작가와 만나서 이야기를 나눠보겠습니다. Congratulations on your new book, The Age of Resilience. Actually, the resilience is one of my favorite English words. But there must be some reason that you chose this particular word. So in the book, you argue that the age of progress with efficiency has ended or is coming to an end. And then now we are facing the age of resilience with the adaptivity. Well, I read the book, of course, I did. This is your Korean version. But could you please explain a little bit what you mean by the age of resilience and why you chose this particular word?
Look, the viruses and the pandemics keep coming, and we are in real-time climate change. You know, for several thousand years, especially in the West, we have always believed that human beings could dominate the planet. You know, in the book of Genesis, God says to Adam, I'm going to expel you from the Garden of Eden, but I'm going to give you dominion over all of the life on earth. That mandate has held with us from the beginning of the Western axial religions until today. The Eastern religions were different, but the Western tradition has prevailed. And so what this means is that we have had a long history that is cut into two different parts. Our species is the youngest species on the planet as far as we know. But in all the time that our species has been here, we adapted to nature. What does that mean? We would have 100,000 years of ice ages and then maybe 10,000 years of thaws. We adapted temporally to that very wild, extreme climates. And so 10,000 years ago, it changed. The ice melted and we began to have a nice warm climate called the Holocene. And then we settled down. We developed primitive agriculture, then the great hydraulic civilizations of the dams, canals, all the way to the proto-industrial and industrial revolution. And so the next stage of our life, instead of adapting temporally to the nature's orientation, we began adapting nature to us. And so it culminated in the age of progress, the Industrial Revolution, the capitalist era. That age of progress dominated all the way up to the president. And this is what's curious. Emmanuel Macron gave an address to the French people on nationwide television. The end of abundance is here. The period of sobriety is now with us. I'm saying is that yes and no, that we are now at a turning point, and it's becoming clear that the age of progress is dying. All you have to do is take a look at the human response. We have always believed that we could tame nature and adjust it to our whims and caprices. And now what we're all finding, nature is much more powerful than we ever thought. And we're beginning to realize we're much smaller and not very consequential to the evolution of this planet. We are in an extinction event. So the young people are coming to the streets and they're saying we need a climate emergency. And here's why I'm somewhat hopeful. This was the first time in history that an entire cohort, an entire generation across all the political and religious boundaries came together and they thought of themselves as a species. This is a turning point in human consciousness. So then the question is, how do we go from understanding we are a species to understanding that we are absolutely interconnected to all of the other species and the ecosystems and the habitats of the earth? We are of nature. There's no such thing as civilization and nature.
Adaptivity and all your arguments in the book seems like a restore the humility as a human being, and we have to understand that we are just one of the species of the so many species here currently and previously existed, and we have to understand and we have to learn how to live with those species and as part of the nature.
The problem here is that we don't have a playbook to how to do this. And the reason is, and this is the great unspoken, it's our ideas about how to organize an economy. It's our concepts of political governance. It's how we educate our populations. It's all of that that's been part of the age of progress that's taken us to where we are. So let's talk about new temporal and spatial values. I taught at the Wharton School, #1 business school in the world. I taught the advanced management program. I never heard any discussion about the shortcomings of efficiency. In fact, efficiency was used in every other sentence in terms of how we are getting along in our businesses. So what we're beginning to see is less talk about efficiency and more talk about adaptivity. Efficiency means making nature conform to our whims and caprices and using it up. Adaptivity means going back to our biological clocks and anticipating changes in the larger spheres that animate life so we can adapt rather than extract, consume, and discard. In business, we always wanted to cut the cost. So we maintained our supply lines, our logistics, so that there was no excess, because that would mean more cost and less revenue to investors. So when the COVID hit, we didn't have a backup inventories. We didn't have alternative supply chains. In nature, it doesn't work that way. Nature's not efficient. It's redundant. You know, when frogs lay their eggs, they lay millions of them, all right? And a few survive. So what we're beginning to learn is that nature is our classroom and that financial capital is no longer the supreme value. It's ecological capital that actually is the wealth of the planet. These are the things we need to know.
Yeah, I mean, I believe your book is actually throwing a lot of agendas we need to talk. I think, unfortunately, a lot of countries now realize how important the climate change issue is and also environmental protection is, and they are trying to start some initiatives like, green energy policies, as you know. But recently, there's some energy crisis because the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and some governments are actually hinting that they're going back to carbon energy. Maybe temporarily, but so how do you see this situation? Do you think it's kind of dangerous, or they're going to use it for just temporarily and going back to green energy initiatives?
The Russian invasion of Ukraine is the last fossil fuel war. We, in the last 200 years, as we moved from wood, because we had depleted the forest, to coal, and then to oil and natural gas and nuclear, what's happened is we had to have huge military establishments all over the world, unprecedented in history, to protect and secure these deposits. And that means that if you take a look, millions of people have died for fossil fuels. And what it suggests is that it's over. But we're fighting a last remaining battle. But here's the bottom line. The fact is that in 2019, the levelized cost of solar and wind dipped below the cost of natural gas. Now, solar and wind is way cheaper than nuclear, way cheaper than oil. And the fixed cost continues to plummet. It's like they're cheaper than all the other energies. The marginal cost is near zero. So what's happened here is trillions and trillions of dollars have exited the fossil fuel industry in the last few years. So I'd like to just give you what I think. What we're beginning to see is a great transformation out of what I would call vertically integrated, centralized economic systems that we've had with the capitalist era for 200 years. We are moving from growth to flourishing as our model. We are moving from finance capital to ecological capital. We're moving from productivity to regenerativity. We're moving from GDP to quality of life indicators, from ownership to access, from markets to networks. We're moving from globalization to localization. These are recognizable symbols of what's beginning to emerge. That's a completely different economic model for the world. That's the age of resilience, so that we can have a more distributed world and rely on solar and wind energy so that we can be local as well as global at the same time and share our energies. Solar and wind force sharing. It forces it because when the sun is shining in one part of the world or the wind's blowing in the other part of the world, you got to share it with the rotation of the earth. So that's going to be a whole new mission. We won't need militaries to defend fossil fuels and uranium. We'll need them to be working in local and regional communities to address climate events.
Well, it's really great to see somebody like you that's showing us a really bright future because, political science community is all pessimistic. So in your book, you mentioned the localization. This is what's going to happen in the age of the resilience. It was like, offshoring, reshoring, and the securing supply chains. But from the political science perspective, this is actually very much of a out of geopolitical competition between the two big countries. Could you please explain us, maybe explain me, so how the localization is going to be put in the age of the resilience?
As you know, our team is engaged in helping major regions of the world make the transformation of the industrial region of France. And what they're finding is that the technology, the digital technology is so cheap that you can set up a very agile, smart, small or medium-sized high-tech SME to blockchain it in cooperatives so it can engage in business all over the world, much cheaper. And a lot of it will eliminate all cross-ocean traffic. So globalization allows you to be able to actually move entire aspects of business without having to have the logistics chains we have today. That's just one example. But I want to kind of shift gears for a minute. the most important thing that we need to understand is that the autonomous self, we need to rethink what a human being's all about. As long as we think we're an autonomous individual and we use nature in order to satisfy our needs, we're lost. What we are learning in science is something very interesting. We are not separate from nature. Every single human body is literally an ecosystem, and the elements of the planet are coming into us through atoms and molecules, where it nestles in with the DNA into our tissue, our cells, our organs for a moment of time, then it leaves and goes somewhere else. So what I'm saying here is we need to be comforted with the fact, instead of being frightened of this planet that's rewilding, we need to understand that we are completely integrated into this planet. We are of the ecosystem. There is no civilization and naturalization. Nature is our classroom. We can begin to understand we will be migrating with climate change all over the planet. So these are some of the new developments that should get comfort to a younger generation in Korea that, wow, we've got a future here, but we have to move from growth to flourishing and from productivity to regenerativity.
I really like your word, like nature is a classroom. And you also emphasize that we have to teach the kids how to treat the nature. We have to do the environmental education as early as possible for the kids. And we have to make them realize that we are part of the nature and not to see the nature as object. Maybe the seeing the nature as an object probably the starting point to use or exploit the nature.
You know what? You actually read the book. I want to congratulate you. There are journalists who don't do their homework, and I really want to thank you.
Of course, of course.
So I want to provide another hopeful story here. You know the Smithsonian Institution. A few years back, the Smithsonian Institution began a study. How have human beings survived? We're thin, we have no fur, we're kind of bipedal, we're kind of scrawny. How did we survive? What they found is that we are among the most, if not the most adaptive species, maybe with the exception of viruses and bacteria. And what they realized is the reason is we have a big neocortex, the big brain. We have language, which allows us to communicate with each other and pass on knowledge to our children and future generations. We have empathy. This is a new development wired into our neural circuitry. So when I experience another's pain or suffering or joy, I can literally feel it as if I were experiencing it because I'm rooting for them to flourish like I root for myself to flourish. It's in our neural circuitry. So what does this mean? What they found is that our ability to empathize and experience the other as ourselves is our strong suit as a collective being. As we move forward into this age of resilience, we need to extend that empathic impulse. Forager hunters were only empathic to their blood tribes, their local tribe, and the others were considered, the enemy. But when you go into the great religions, depending on what religion you were in, you saw that as your fictional family. In the great ideological age, the nation states, we identified with our country as our mother and our father. But now we're moving beyond that, and our kids, our young people, they're beginning to extend empathy to our fellow creatures. Biology, we call it biophilia. And what it means is that children, little babies, toddlers, have a natural instinct in their neural circuitry to identify with other life. They have done studies of dreams of young toddlers who are 3, 4, 5 years old. You know what? 70% of the dreams of young kids around the world are about other animals, especially baby animals. They feel at one with these other creatures. They are just like us. When they get into school, systems teach us nature is just passive resources. We need to commodify it and use it and learn how to do it in shorter time periods. And so they lose all of that. So there's a new phenomenon in the West called forest schools. The young people would have nature as their classroom. And what they learned is when nature was their classroom, they were so excited because nature is much more exciting. And around the world, we spend approximately 7 hours a day or more on the screen, TV, iPad, computer. So we're locking ourselves out from nature, but the real thrill is being engaged with life. And I'm not opposed to virtual realities because we're going to be living sometimes indoors, then outdoors. But to see the metaverse as a completely virtual world to live in is so sad. It robs our young people of life. So there's a role for virtual realities. That's third industrial revolution infrastructure. But our young people have to be out in nature.
So we talked about like how we can harmonize human beings as a species to the nature. But we also have to talk about how we can harmonize ourselves. In the United States, urban and rural division is so deep, and I'm not really sure how can they meet in the middle.
we're going to see a completely new approach to governance. We're not going to give up nation states. We're not going to give up regions and localities. But when climate disasters hit, they're overwhelming. And there is no form of government that can handle them. So we're starting to formalize what we call citizens' assemblies, which are an extension of local government, in which citizens are elected to these assemblies, citizen assemblies during their lifetime, to engage in a whole range of more distributed affairs. For example, local budgeting. We're seeing it in policing. Communities are not the police, but they engage with the police and help it work. We have juries made up of citizens, and they determine in very sophisticated criminal and civil cases the guilt or innocence of somebody. Or you take firefighting. 65% of all the firefighters in America are volunteers. So we want to extend citizens' assemblies so that people can be engaged in their 19 kilometers of the biosphere, be engaged in the eco-stewardship of their community, and it will give them a sense of community, a sense that we are part of a larger ecosystem. We are not an autonomous agent. So I think there's some hope there as well. Now, governance is also changing. Ecosystems do not care about political boundaries. Climate change does not care about political boundaries. So what we are seeing is that when a flood or a drought or a wildfire happens, or a hurricane, it crosses political boundaries. So the different governances have to share. It's called bio-regional governance. This is going to happen everywhere. You're going to have to not only keep the existing governance, but you're going to have to share governance across common ecosystems to prepare, rescue, restore, and create resilient infrastructure. In my country, the 8 states that abut the Great Lakes, that's 20% of the fresh water in the world. And the 2 Canadian provinces share their ecosystem and are working on it so that we begin to take our responsibility regionally and we overcome these political boundaries and we cross them. We still have those other governing bodies, but we have to work across them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I mean, we still maintain the nation state, but actually in the case of the climate change and ecosystem, we sometimes have to go beyond the national border and also cooperate regionally, which happens in Canada and the United States. I think about Korea, where we can cooperate with. But I really like the idea, actually, about the citizens' assembly. You mentioned they chose the people randomly, actually, like a grand jury. Is there any mandatory rule to be put on? Well, I mean, I was chosen as a person to serve the citizens' assembly, but what if I lose it? Is there any mandatory rule you're thinking of?
With juries, somewhere around 8 million people in a given year are called up. Many of them can't do it because of job obligations or they're ill or some other reason. Then it gets down to about 3 million that actually, come to be in them. And then of that, about 1.8 million actually are picked by the judge and the attorneys to be in it. So at any given time. And in my country, everyone's called up at least once. And it works. And they do pretty well. These juries have to have unanimous consent. That means they have to come to an understanding across all of their particular biases. So it's the wonderful example of the kind of education we need. Our school systems don't do that. Our school systems are all in silos. You have each profession, social sciences, the natural sciences, each profession has their own discipline, their own language, their own rewards. So they see the world in a smaller and smaller frame. We have to move to interdisciplinary approaches to knowledge where we learn that things are not simple. Everything connects to everything else. Anytime something happens in the world, no matter how small, it affects something else. Everything is so interconnected. This planet is alive. So the more we have systemic learning, complex adaptive social ecological systems learning, we think more mindfully and critically across all the barriers so that we can use all of our academic knowledge in a way that allows us to understand how nature works. It's very complex. And then I realized that we also have a responsibility because we have the biggest neocortex and began to think more systemically, break down those borders. We realize that the agencies of this planet are so animated and alive. And if we can find a way not to be frightened, but also to learn how to live within these ecosystems, we will see we're part of a bigger thing called life. It's a very, very hopeful sign. And I'm hoping that all the young people will listen to this and go out and change the world. And we can do it in less than 25 years and create an age of resilience. So I think the age of resilience is my way of saying this conversation's already begun. And there's going to be places like Korea that will be first movers. Korea is a very interesting culture. From what little I know, over history, it's been subdued by other countries and it's been subjugated by other countries. It's had to learn how to survive and empathize and relate as a community. And it survived many, many centuries that way. It's learned to be attuned, to listen, to be aware of what's going around in order to adjust. But that now can free up to think of freedom not as exclusivity and autonomy, but inclusivity. The more inclusive we are, the more free we feel.
I actually thought the opposite way about Korea. I mean, we are so busy to achieve the economic development. I mean, we've been through really, really a dark history in the early 20th century, as you know. Well, we have achieved a lot of economic development, but this is not all we wanted. So now, maybe it is time that we have to go for the quality of life. And I'm really impressed that you still have hope for the human beings. Because after all the exploitation and bad behavior about nature, but still you think we have a capability to fix the problems and go back to nature, like Rousseau said.
I think it's right. We got to remember that Korea was the poster child of post-World War II development. And although that's pushed an agenda that really is the last stages of the age of progress. But your cultural DNA is based on relationship, being parts of community, and thinking of nature as harmony. It's also in the cultural DNA across Asia. If you can recapture the cultural DNA in your being and then say, okay, this is what we did since World War II, but we were maybe the final example of the age of progress. Does anyone in Korea think that this is still the age of progress? That we're going to be able to extract more and more of the planet in shorter time intervals? They're going to be able to be more autonomous and live in virtual worlds independent of the natural world that's now rewilding? No. It's going to be the Gen Zs, the young millennials, and who comes after. They know there's something wrong. And if anything, the age of resilience, I did this for that generation. It's now they have to go way beyond whatever I've written in this book. The idea was just to get out some basic, if you will, assumptions that have to change. And then let's make sure that the school system is in Korea and the businesses. I work with many of your large companies. I admire what they've done in one way, but now it's got to change. We got to think more about how we adapt and have redundancy and build in more agile, small and medium-sized companies that can localize. Big companies will still be here, but the ones that survive, they will learn to aggregate with small and medium-sized enterprises across these cooperative systems so that they can begin to think locally rather than globally. That's the success in the future for the large companies.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Rifkin. And it's amazing to encounter the real writer of the book. I really read impressively. Been a pleasure, and I'm going to deliver your message to a lot of Korean people.
Let's stay in touch, and anytime you'd like to have a follow-up conversation and see how things are going in Korea, I would be more than happy to do that with you.
That'd be really great. Thank you so much.
And say hello to all my friends in Korea. Thank you.